As Georgia walked toward Grace, clutching that gift, I could feel every eye in the room turn toward them. What my daughter said next would expose years of favoritism and deliver the most perfect revenge imaginable. But to understand how we got to this moment, I need to take you back to the beginning. When Jack Craig proposed to me on a rainy Thursday evening in his mother's living room, I thought I was stepping into a fairy tale. Grace had spent the entire evening fussing over dinner preparations, complimenting my dress, and asking detailed questions about my work as a dental hygienist. The house felt warm and welcoming, with its perfectly coordinated decor and the subtle scent of vanilla candles. Jack's siblings were friendly, his father cracked dad jokes that actually made me laugh, and Grace herself insisted I call her Mom before the evening was over. The signs were subtle at first, so subtle that I convinced myself I was imagining them. Grace would pause just a beat too long before responding to my comments during family dinners, her smile never quite reaching her eyes when she looked directly at me. When I mentioned wanting to redecorate our bedroom, Grace would suggest colors that I'd already told her I disliked, as if she hadn't been listening at all. These moments felt like paper cuts. Small, barely noticeable, but they accumulated over time. Everything changed when Georgia entered the picture. My 5-year-old daughter from my previous marriage was quiet and observant, the kind of child who noticed when adults weren't being genuine. Grace's reaction to Georgia was immediate and unmistakable. She would make comments about how children from broken homes needed extra structure, how different family values could be challenging to navigate, and how Georgia might need time to adjust to their family's way of doing things. The word "there" always stung, as if Georgia and I were permanent outsiders trying to squeeze into spaces we didn't belong. Jack had moved mountains to legally adopt Georgia before our wedding, spending thousands on attorney fees and court proceedings because he wanted her to be his daughter in every way that mattered. In our home, there were no step relationships or half connections. Georgia was his daughter, period. He hung her artwork on the refrigerator, attended every school play, and tucked her into bed with the same bedtime stories his own father had read to him. But Grace operated by different rules. She would send Georgia birthday cards addressed to Georgia Smith, my maiden name, even though Georgia's legal name had been Georgia Craig for over a year. The family gatherings became exercises in careful observation. Grace would call each grandchild over to sit beside her on the couch, dispensing hugs and asking about school projects. But when Georgia approached, Grace's attention would somehow be needed elsewhere. The other children received matching Christmas pajamas for the annual holiday photo, but Georgia would stand slightly apart in whatever festive outfit I'd bought her. I found myself making excuses that even I didn't believe. Grace was still adjusting to having a new granddaughter. She showed love differently than I was used to. I told myself that keeping the peace was more important than making waves, that confronting Grace would only create drama that would hurt Jack and potentially damage Georgia's relationship with her new family. Jack saw what was happening, but he was caught between protecting his daughter and maintaining his relationship with his mother. He would bring up Grace's behavior during our late-night conversations, acknowledging that something wasn't right. But he always ended these discussions with promises to handle it, eventually. Meanwhile, Georgia was learning that some family members were more important than others, that love came with conditions. But beneath the surface, Jack's smile was masking something far more serious, and I'd soon discover why. The Thanksgiving incident that year revealed just how calculated Grace's cruelty had become. She had spent weeks preparing personalized dinner plates for each grandchild, hand-painting their names in elegant gold script and sealing them with special ceramic coating. She made a big production of presenting each child with their custom plate, explaining how she'd chosen colors that matched their personalities. Emma got deep purple with silver accents. Tyler's was forest green with gold trim. Madison received soft pink with delicate white flowers. Georgia sat at the kids' table with a chipped ceramic plate that Grace had pulled from the back of her cabinet, the kind of spare dish you'd use for a casual lunch. When Georgia asked me quietly why her plate didn't have her name on it, I felt something crack inside my chest. I mumbled something about how special plates were just for decoration, but Georgia's eyes told me she understood exactly what was happening. That night, as I tucked Georgia into bed, she whispered words that still haunt me. Maybe she thinks I'm just visiting. The matter-of-fact way she said it broke my heart. At 7 years old, my daughter had already figured out that she existed in a different category from her cousins, that her place at the family table was conditional and temporary. I found myself weaving lies that tasted bitter on my tongue, telling Georgia that Grace was forgetful, that she loved her in her own special way, that some people just showed affection differently. Each excuse felt more hollow than the last, and I could see in Georgia's patient nods that she was humoring me, protecting my feelings while accepting her role as the family outsider. The psychological damage was becoming impossible to ignore. Georgia stopped asking why she didn't get the same treatment as her cousins. She stopped expecting to be included in Grace's spontaneous ice cream runs or shopping trips. At family gatherings, she would find a corner spot and sit quietly, no longer trying to insert herself into conversations or games. She developed a way of making herself small, shrinking into furniture and fading into the background like she was apologizing for taking up space. When Grace would lavish attention on the other children, asking about their friends and school projects, Georgia would watch with the resigned expression of someone who had learned not to expect her turn. I could see Jack's jaw clench each time he watched Georgia shrink into silence. He would ball his hands into fists when Grace would interrupt Georgia mid-sentence to coo over something one of the other children had said. But every time I brought up Grace's behavior, Jack would promise to handle it eventually, when the timing was better, when he could find the right words. Meanwhile, I was left carrying the weight of Georgia's confused questions and hurt feelings, trying to shield her from the reality that her own grandmother-in-law had decided she wasn't worth loving. The pattern was becoming entrenched, and Georgia was learning to accept it as normal. She was developing the quiet resignation of a child who had stopped believing she deserved better. What I didn't realize was that Jack's silence wasn't indifference. It was the calm before a storm that had been building for months. After George's 8th birthday party, when Jack watched his mother hand the other grandchildren cash-stuffed envelopes while giving Georgia a single pack of stickers from the dollar store, I confronted him at midnight. He agreed but kept deferring action with promises of, "I'll talk to her next week." Week after week, those conversations ended the same way, with Jack acknowledging every incident but retreating into worn-out promises that never materialized. The emotional weight of watching Georgia fade a little more after each family gathering was crushing me. I started dreading holidays and birthdays, knowing they meant another round of watching my daughter realize she didn't matter as much as her cousins. Georgia would come home from Grace's house and go straight to her room, closing the door with the quiet resignation of someone who had stopped expecting better. She'd stopped asking me why Grace treated her differently, and somehow that silence was worse than all her previous questions combined. I was beginning to understand that my strategy of patience and understanding wasn't protecting Georgia. It was teaching her that this treatment was acceptable. Georgia's questions evolved from innocent confusion to heartbreaking clarity that made my chest tighten every time she spoke. "Am I really part of this family, or am I just visiting until you and Dad get tired of me too?" she asked one evening after Grace had excluded her from a cousin's sleepover. The way she phrased it, like she was expecting us to eventually send her away, revealed how deeply the exclusion had affected her sense of security. Another time, she wondered aloud if Grace would be happier if she just stayed home during family gatherings, offering to make the sacrifice herself rather than continuing to endure the rejection. Everything changed at Tyler's 9th birthday party in October. I watched Jack's face transform as Grace made a huge production of cutting the cake, giving each grandchild beautifully decorated corner pieces with extra frosting roses, while casually handing Georgia the plain end piece that nobody else wanted. Grace didn't even look at Georgia as she passed over the plate, but she spent 5 minutes explaining to Tyler why his piece was special, because it had his favorite blue frosting flower. Jack's hands were shaking when he walked into the kitchen, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw genuine anger replace his usual diplomatic concern. That night, Jack disappeared into his home office for hours. I could hear him typing, printing documents, and moving around with the focused energy of someone who had finally made a decision. When I asked what he was doing, he just said he was handling the Grace situation once and for all. The next morning, he sat Georgia down at our kitchen table with a small red velvet jewelry box that he'd wrapped carefully with gold ribbon. He explained to her that sometimes adults fail to protect children the way they should, but that she had more power than she realized. Jack told Georgia that the box contained everything she needed to stand up for herself when the grown-ups couldn't do it for her. He made her promise to keep it safe and to use it only when she decided she'd had enough of being treated unfairly. I watched my husband transform that morning from someone who avoided conflict to someone who was preparing our daughter to fight her own battles with the tools he'd given her. As December approached, and Grace started planning her annual Christmas extravaganza, I noticed Jack carrying himself differently. He had the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly how a story was going to end, even though he wouldn't tell me what he'd put in that mysterious box. Something about his focused energy told me this fight was finally about to go public. Grace's living room looked like something from a holiday magazine spread, with her 12-foot Douglas fir dripping in coordinated gold and burgundy ornaments. The whole scene was designed to create magic, but I could already feel the familiar knot forming in my stomach as I watched Grace survey her kingdom with satisfied pride. Georgia walked into that picture-perfect room wearing her favorite sparkly gold dress, clutching a small wrapped package against her chest like it contained something precious. She'd spent hours in art class creating a wooden trinket box for Grace, carefully painting it purple and gluing on rhinestones one by one with the focused concentration that only 8-year-olds possess. The word Grandma was written across the top in crooked glitter letters, and she'd lined the inside with soft felt because she thought Grace might want to keep jewelry in it. I watched her approach Grace with the hopeful excitement of a child who still believed that effort and love could win over anyone. Grace's reaction to George's handmade gift was like watching someone dismiss a piece of trash. She took the box with barely a glance, muttering something about how thoughtful it was before setting it aside on the end table like discarded wrapping paper. Meanwhile, she made an enormous production of receiving the store-bought gifts from her biological grandchildren, holding up each item for the entire room to admire. The contrast was so stark that even the other adults in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The gift-giving ceremony began with Grace calling each child forward like she was crowning royalty. Emma received the latest iPad in its pristine white box, with Grace explaining how she'd specifically chosen the rose gold color because it matched Emma's personality. Tyler got a thick envelope stuffed with cash and a gaming headset that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Madison received a delicate gold necklace with a heart pendant that Grace had personally selected from the jewelry store downtown. When Georgia's turn finally came, Grace's voice dropped to a flat, perfunctory tone. "Georgia, this is for you," she said, holding out a simple lavender candle in a plain glass jar. The gift tag read, "To Jack's girl," in Grace's neat handwriting, not even acknowledging Georgia as a granddaughter. The candle looked like something Grace had grabbed from a clearance bin at the last minute, the kind of generic item you'd give to someone whose name you'd forgotten. I watched Georgia's face as she processed the stark difference between her gift and what her cousins had received, seeing her expression shift from anticipation to quiet understanding. The other children sat surrounded by expensive electronics and jewelry, their faces glowing with excitement as they explored their new treasures. Georgia held her candle carefully, as if it might break, thanking Grace in a small voice that carried the weight of 3 years of accumulated disappointment. She didn't complain or ask why her gift was different. She'd learned not to expect equal treatment, and somehow that acceptance was more heartbreaking than tears would have been. I watched my daughter retreat into herself, her sparkly dress suddenly looking too bright for the shadow she'd learned to occupy in this family. I noticed Jack's hands tighten around his knees, the signal I'd been waiting for. Something shifted in his expression during that moment, a decision crystallizing in real time as he witnessed his mother's cruelty played out in front of the entire family. The only sign that Jack had reached his breaking point was the way he looked at Georgia, then nodded almost imperceptibly toward that mysterious red box he'd given her months ago. Georgia woke up the next morning with something I'd never seen before, a quiet determination that seemed to radiate from her 8-year-old frame. "Mom, can I wear my sparkly dress again today?" she asked, her voice carrying a steadiness that caught me off guard. Most kids would have been devastated by yesterday's candle incident, but Georgia moved around our house that morning with the focused energy of someone who had made an important decision. When I asked if she was excited about Grace's traditional Boxing Day brunch, she just nodded and said she had something important to do. I watched Georgia walk to her bedroom and retrieve the small red velvet box that Jack had given her months earlier. She held it against her chest like it contained something precious, her small fingers gripping the soft fabric with a confidence I'd never seen before. The box had been sitting on her dresser for weeks, and I'd noticed her looking at it during quiet moments, but she'd never opened it in front of me. Now she carried it with the purposeful grip of a child who had finally found her voice and knew exactly how to use it. Grace's bridal magazine brunch buzzed around us, everyone chatting over mimosas and eggs. Benedict, like the previous evening's events, had never happened. I watched Georgia survey the scene from her usual spot at the far end of the children's table, her sparkly dress catching the light as she clutched that mysterious box in her lap. Then something shifted. Georgia stood up from her chair with movements that seemed too deliberate for someone her age, and the casual breakfast conversation began to fade as family members noticed her walking directly toward Grace. The room fell completely silent as my 8-year-old daughter approached the woman who had spent 3 years treating her like an unwelcome guest. Grace looked up from her conversation with a puzzled expression, clearly not expecting to be interrupted by the child she'd been systematically ignoring. A hush rippled through the room as Georgia set the box down directly in front of Grace's plate. Everyone leaned forward. She delivered words that Jack had clearly rehearsed with her. "Grandma, Dad told me to give this to you if you ever ignored me again." Her voice carried across the silent room with the clarity of someone who had practiced this moment, and Grace's confused laughter died in her throat as she realized that every adult in the room was now watching her response. Grace opened the box to reveal a framed photo of Jack holding Georgia on her adoption day, both of them grinning at the camera with the joy of a father and daughter who had chosen each other. The caption read, "Day One Dad," in elegant gold letters, and I watched Grace's face drain of color as she processed the image. Beneath the photo lay Georgia's official adoption papers, signed by a judge and bearing the court seal that made Jack's legal relationship to Georgia absolutely undeniable. The final item was Jack's handwritten letter, folded carefully and placed on top of the legal documents like a final verdict. As Grace lifted the letter with trembling hands, I could see her usual composure beginning to crack under the weight of what she was about to read. Georgia stood quietly beside the table, watching the adults finally confront the reality she had been living with for years. The holiday atmosphere hung suspended, waiting for Grace's reaction to Jack's carefully chosen words. Grace's face went through a series of expressions as she processed the contents of that red velvet box. Confusion, shock, and then a rage so pure it seemed to transform her features completely. She held the adoption papers in her trembling hands, staring at Jack's signature and the official court seal like they were written in a foreign language. For 3 years, she had operated under the delusion that Georgia was a temporary addition to the family, someone who could be dismissed or ignored without real consequences. The legal documents made it impossible to maintain that fantasy any longer. Jack's letter was a masterpiece of controlled fury, written with the precision of someone who had been documenting every slight and exclusion for months. He had recorded the Christmas when Georgia received dollar store stickers while her cousins got cash-filled envelopes, the Thanksgiving when Grace served Georgia on a chipped plate while the other children ate from personalized dishes, and Grace's consistent pattern of referring to Georgia as Jack's girl instead of her granddaughter. Each paragraph built a case that was impossible to deny or dismiss as misunderstanding. Jack's concluding ultimatum was simple: accept Georgia as your granddaughter, or you lose access to your son and grandkids. There was no middle ground, no room for negotiation or gradual improvement. Grace had to choose between her prejudice and her relationship with her son, and the choice had to be made immediately and publicly. Grace's first instinct was to deflect blame onto me, sputtering about how I had poisoned Jack against her and turned him against his own mother. She accused me of being jealous of her relationship with Jack, of manipulating him into choosing sides. But Jack's response was immediate and firm. He stepped forward and told his mother that she had created this situation entirely through her own actions, that the embarrassment she was feeling was the natural consequence of years of cruel behavior toward an innocent child. Jack's sister Sarah looked down at her hands, clearly remembering all the times she had watched Georgia being excluded without speaking up. His brother Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair, unable to meet anyone's eyes. They had all seen what was happening, but they had chosen the comfort of avoiding confrontation over protecting a child who needed their support. Throughout this entire confrontation, Georgia stood beside Grace's chair with a dignity that seemed impossible for someone her age. She didn't cry or hide behind my legs. She watched the adults finally acknowledge what she had been living with for years, her small frame somehow radiating strength and self-possession. Jack's decision to let Georgia deliver the message herself had given her agency in her own defense, transforming her from a victim into someone who could stand up for herself. The public nature of the revelation stripped away any possibility of private denial or quiet dismissal. Grace couldn't claim later that she had been misunderstood or that the situation was more complicated than it appeared. Every family member in that room had witnessed her behavior and heard Jack's documented evidence. The carefully maintained facade of family unity cracked and fell away completely, revealing the ugly truth that had been hiding underneath years of polite holiday gatherings. With that, we rose and walked out. Together. Finally, a true family. Georgia held both Jack's hand and mine as we crossed the threshold, stepping away from years of forced politeness and one-sided compromise. The weeks following our confrontation with Grace brought something I hadn't expected: peace. For the first time in 3 years, I could plan family activities without that familiar knot forming in my stomach, wondering how Grace would manage to make Georgia feel excluded this time. Our house felt lighter somehow, like we'd finally exhaled after holding our breath for years. Jack moved through our home with a relaxed confidence I hadn't seen since before we'd gotten married, no longer carrying the weight of trying to bridge two incompatible worlds. The toxic dynamic that had poisoned every holiday gathering and family celebration was finally gone, leaving space for us to figure out what our family actually looked like when we weren't constantly managing someone else's prejudice. Georgia's response to losing her grandmother surprised me completely. I had braced myself for tears, for questions about why Grace didn't love her, for the kind of heartbreak that comes when a child realizes they've been rejected by someone who should have protected them. Instead, Georgia seemed lighter, like she'd been carrying a heavy backpack that someone had finally helped her remove. She stopped shrinking into corners during family gatherings with Jack's extended family, stopped automatically expecting less than everyone else received. The relief in her posture was unmistakable. She no longer had to perform worthiness for someone who had already decided she would never be enough. We started creating new traditions that actually meant something to us instead of forcing ourselves into Grace's rigid expectations. Christmas morning became about sleeping in and making pancakes together instead of rushing to get dressed for Grace's formal gift exchange. We spent New Year's Eve building blanket forts in the living room instead of attending Grace's champagne party, where Georgia would sit at the children's table while the adults pretended everything was normal. These new traditions focused on intention and genuine care rather than obligation, creating space for Georgia to be herself without constantly measuring her worth against arbitrary standards. 3 weeks after the confrontation, a small package arrived addressed to Georgia. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet with a note written in careful 8-year-old handwriting. "I'm sorry Grandma was mean. You're my cousin forever. Love, Maddie." Georgia wore that bracelet every day, touching it whenever she needed a reminder that some family bonds transcended the adults' conflicts. Maddie's gesture proved that blood relations don't automatically create family bonds, but chosen love creates connections that can survive any storm. That bracelet became Georgia's proof that she was worthy of love, regardless of what Grace had tried to teach her. Jack transformed completely after the confrontation, shedding the guilt that had paralyzed him for years. He stopped making excuses for his mother's behavior and started embracing his role as Georgia's fierce protector without hesitation. I watched him help Georgia with homework one evening, praising her effort and celebrating her progress, and realized he was no longer holding back part of himself out of loyalty to someone who had never deserved it. He had chosen his daughter over his mother's approval, and that choice freed him to be the father Georgia had always needed. I had to confront my own role in enabling Grace's behavior during those years of trying to keep the peace. Sometimes love requires setting firm boundaries, even when it means making difficult family decisions. Learning to prioritize Georgia's emotional well-being over my discomfort with confrontation was one of the hardest lessons I've ever had to master. Georgia's confidence returned gradually, like watching a flower bloom in time-lapse photography. She started speaking up in class and auditioned for the school play, something she'd never dared before. The small red velvet box that had delivered such powerful truth now sat on Georgia's dresser as a symbol of her strength and our family's commitment to protecting her dignity. That box represented more than revenge. It represented the moment we all decided that Georgia's worth wasn't up for debate, and that even the smallest person could change everything when given the right tools. Georgia's courage that morning proved small voices can change everything when someone believes in them. Jack's decision to empower his 8-year-old daughter to stand up for herself created a moment that changed everything, not just for our family, but for Georgia's understanding of her own worth. The story taught us that real family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about who shows up consistently with love and respect, who protects you when you can't protect yourself, and who refuses to let anyone treat you as less than you deserve. If you've ever had to stand up for someone you love, let us know in the comments. Your story might give someone else the courage to speak up.